Welcome to the 2021 Midas MassSaves Conference. We are just so thrilled to have everyone here and online and to really feel like things are starting to return to normal. We want to thank very much all of our sponsors, some of whom are here, as well as those who have dialed in. Some of our last minute sponsors include Citizens Bank and Boston Private Bank, and we're just really grateful for their ongoing support. As I mentioned, we do have folks that have joined us this morning, both here in the room, which is so nice to see faces again, and online, and that's great. To be able to offer a hybrid event is such a gift. We have a number of fantastic panelists, and I'm really excited for everyone to hear all the great things that they have to say about closing wealth gaps. And I'd really like now to introduce our keynote speaker, Keeanga-Yamahtta. Keeanga writes and speaks on Black politics, social movements, and racial inequality in the United States. She's the author of Race for Profit: How Banks and the Real Estate Industry Undermine Black Home Ownership. Race for Profit was a semi-finalist for the 2019 National Book Award and a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History in 2020. She is also a 2021 MacArthur Fellow. So I couldn't be more thrilled to have her join us today. Thank you so much, Keeanga, and over to you.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks to the Midas Collaborative for the invitation to come speak with you today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. I'm going to talk about the racial wealth gap as it exists today, but then also put that into some historical perspective, and end by talking about the creation of low-income homeownership programs in the 1960s, really the rise and fall of those programs, to get a historical understanding of not just why the racial wealth gap exists, but why it remains difficult to overcome, but also how it is embedded within larger patterns of inequality in the United States. I should say I'm also a historian. I'm a professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. And so I always like to do these types of talks, both from a contemporary standpoint, but also by looking historically. And so with that, I'll get started. So over the last several years, the racial wealth gap has come into focus as an explanation for many of the disparities that continue to shape Black life chances in comparison to their white peers. The racial wealth gap has emerged as a serious focal point of public policy conversations about opening greater opportunities for African Americans and ending the ongoing legacy of racial discrimination. Today, I want to talk about the racial wealth gap, what it is, why it exists, but also why it is an insufficient discussion point in understanding both racial inequality and understanding that racial inequality in many ways only reflects a much larger problem of wealth inequality more generally in our society. While many have become comfortable discussing what many have termed systemic racism since the summer of 2020, many more have been uncomfortable in naming the system that is implicated. And to that extent, what I'm really trying to get at is that we can't just kind of pick pieces of the problem apart, but we have to look at the total picture of why not just there's a racial wealth gap, but there is an enormous wealth gap between the rich, poor, working class, and middle class in the United States. And so to that end, in terms of being able to elucidate all of these issues, as I said earlier, I want to focus on the rise and fall of a low-income homeownership program created in the late 1960s and early 1970s to understand the institutional roots to housing inequality in particular, but also as a root cause for the other kinds of inequities that shape much of Black life. For me, this is ultimately a larger discussion than can be solved or a larger problem than can be solved by implementing this or that singular policy. But we have to ask why the policies that we do have, the existing policies that we do have, are either not enforced or do not work. But we also have to ask about the ways that inequality is preserved by existing beyond the reach of public policy. By focusing on the racial wealth gap instead of larger patterns of inequality in the society, we can ultimately limit the discussion of how we include Black people into more, we can limit the discussion only to how we include African Americans into more of the governing and financial institutions within the United States, while not necessarily dealing with the larger questions about the social issues into which we are proposing that more African Americans be included too. So what kind of society are we saying that African Americans need to be more integrated into, instead of just looking at the way that Black people continue to be excluded from certain governing and financial institutions? So what is the racial wealth gap? Wealth is the sum total of one's assets after all debt has been accounted for. For every dollar a typical white household has, a Black one has 12 cents, a divide that has grown persistently over the last half century. The net worth of a typical white family in the US today is $171,000, nearly 10 times greater than that of a Black family at $17,000. The racial wealth gap remains even for families with the same, even for families within the same income group. So we're not looking at middle-class white people and poor Black people. We are looking at groups that are within the same income level. Even in the top 10% by income, which only includes 3.6% of African Americans, the racial wealth gap is still quite large. Median net worth for white families in the top 10% is $1.7 million versus $343,000 for Black families. The racial wealth gap exists in every income group except the bottom quintile, where median net worth is zero for everyone. The question is, why does this gap exist? There is no single definitive explanation for the racial wealth gap, but all along the ways in which one becomes indebted, makes an income, or all other exchanges that are mediated by race and class. African Americans are disproportionately working class and poor. The Black poverty rate, for example, is 18% compared to 10% for white Americans. Black Americans, of course, represent somewhere between 12 and 13% of the population. So this is an overrepresentation of African Americans within the ranks of the poor. Black workers in the US earn on average 30% or $10,000 less than their white peers. And nearly half of Black workers are employed in the healthcare, retail, accommodation, and food service industries, with the vast majority in lower paying service roles instead of professional or managerial roles. The annual median income or wage of all US workers is about $42,000. 43% of Black workers earn less than $30,000 per year, highlighting how they are overrepresented in low-paying jobs. While Black Americans are underrepresented in high-paying professions, only 5% of physicians are Black, and just under 5% of software developers are Black. When Black workers are stuck in place with income, with lower incomes, then we see that there is an impossibility of saving, investing, or taking actions that are prescribed for multiplying one's income into personal wealth. We can also see how lower incomes and lack of savings can have cascading impacts in the lives of poor and working class people. It means that you live in a world marked by fragility, an inability to fix a car, to weather a healthcare crisis, to weather a hike in your rent, a hike in property taxes, throws the precarious balance of personal economics into disarray. Lower incomes and a lack of discretionary funds create havoc and can ultimately lead to even higher debt. The lack of stability in housing is especially consequential. To begin with, most African Americans are renters, and being a renter in the US right now is extremely disadvantageous. By all accounts, the US continues to face an affordable housing crisis. Last summer, rents in the US reached their highest level ever of $1,200 per month for rent. So even as wages and salaries have incrementally risen over the last 40 years, rents have risen exponentially. In just the last year alone, there has been a 10% increase in rents across the country. More than 50% of Black renters are rent burdened, meaning that they pay more than 30% of their monthly income towards rent. In one sense, this is why the scramble for homeownership in Black communities is so intense. But despite all of the talk about Black homeownership and Black homeowners, only 44% of African Americans own their own homes. This is compared to more than 70% of white Americans. So all of the benefits regarding taxes and built equity over time are lost for the majority of African Americans. Moreover, and crucial for this discussion, even among existing Black homeowners, the benefits of homeownership do not accrue to them equally in comparison to their white peers. Black people are often targeted for more expensive loans. Black families may have to pay more upfront because of credit records that do not account for discriminatory factors in the work and debt histories of Black families. But once in a house, properties in Black majority neighborhoods are valued differently in comparison to white majority neighborhoods, creating higher equity and than in white majority neighborhoods where there is higher equity and the home turns into a more valuable asset from which white families can draw against compared to Black families. So when analysts and experts focus on creating more Black homeowners as a solution to the racial wealth gap, they are most certainly not taking into account that Black properties are devalued to such an extent that even as a homeowner, it is unlikely that African Americans would ever catch up in wealth simply by owning a home. A Brookings Institute study that was organized by researcher Andre Perry found that homes in majority Black neighborhoods were undervalued by $48,000 on average compared with those in neighborhoods where there were fewer than 1% of the residents were Black. Another study found that the difference in average home appraisals between neighborhoods that are majority white and those that are majority Black has doubled since 1980. In 2017 alone, according to Andre Perry's study, that amounted to $156 billion in lost equity for homeowners in Black neighborhoods, the lower appraisal rate. And so the fact that the difference in home appraisals between majority white and majority black neighborhoods has doubled since 1980 alone says also that this is not just a historical problem. This is not just a hangover from the past, but this is how we understand that discriminatory practices in real estate and banking continue in the current period, in the contemporary world. So all of this is to say that the racial wealth gap is real. And there is not one thing that anyone can point to and say that here is the reason why. Instead, it is the cumulative total of two things. One is that it reflects the inequality Black workers face in wages and salaries and the disproportionate amount of debt that they take on as a result. Basically, Black workers must debt manage this inequality in wages and salary to bridge the gap between lower wages and higher expenses. This means taking on loans that are often predatory. It means relying on credit cards that have extremely, in some cases, extraordinarily high interest rates. It means taking on student loans and other kinds of debt incurring means to bridge the income gap. Not only does this make wealth accumulation impossible, but it also makes saving, simply saving, unrealistic. The second reason is historical. The history of racism, dispossession, segregation, extraction, and economic exploitation has animated the entirety of Black life since the abolition of slavery. Not only did these factors create poverty among Black people, but they combined to mark African Americans as inferior. That is to say, the social effects of these public policies, in combination with the private action of business, not only impoverished Black communities, but without the actions taken by these institutions fully understood and comprehended, the conditions that were created as a result were blamed on problems believed to be intrinsic to Black communities and Black people. In other words, people victimized by racism and discrimination were then blamed for the problems that were created as a result. So it's only in very rare and sometimes fleeting moments, usually during some kind of racial turmoil or crisis like that in the 1960s or like that of the summer of 2020, do we examine the material roots to Black inequality, moving the discussion away from the perceived problems in Black communities. Because most of the time, the conditions of inequality and inequity themselves are blamed on Black family structure, Black culture, Black men, Black women, Black children, or something intrinsic to these people and not the institutions that provide access to capital and opportunity. Consider, historically, Black people were emancipated from slavery and given absolutely nothing. No clothing, no land, no money, no jobs. And the reason I start here, and I think it's important, is to understand the cumulative impact. So I said a few minutes ago that when we look at the practices in housing and see the differential in home appraisals between Black and Black majority communities versus white majority communities, that this was an example of how racism continues to be a factor in the real estate industry in the contemporary sense. But it is also in combination with the cumulative effects of racism over time. And so emancipation, no clothing, no land, no money, no jobs. The Southern elite relied on the threat of starvation among African Americans to compel them to return to their old jobs as slaves and to work for next to nothing in terms of wages. At the turn of the 19th into the 20th century, when African Americans began to migrate out of the rural South into larger cities across the country, they were confronted with racist mob violence that relegated them to certain neighborhoods and certain kinds of jobs. The neighborhoods quickly became overcrowded. City officials often refused to perform basic city services, including cleaning, street cleaning, trash pickup in Black neighborhoods. Landlords knew that Black renters had nowhere else that they could move and refused to do basic maintenance, allowing the homes that African Americans lived in to fall into disrepair. Banks refused loans to Black people who wanted to buy and invest in their neighborhoods. But the policies and actions of the private sector that allowed for the deterioration of these neighborhoods was not fully known or understood in the public. So a popular narrative ensued, which became Black people don't know how to take care of their property. Black people do not care about the condition of the neighborhoods that they live in. Black people don't care about trash mounting on their streets. And these conditions of disrepair and dilapidation created through landlord and institutional neglect were instead blamed on Black people and ultimately became the pretext for banks to designate Black people and their neighborhoods as more risky. When the US first began to form its welfare state in the 1930s, it did so by excluding most African Americans from its most important gains. Why did they do this? Essentially to appease Southern politicians who feared that the emergence of a welfare state would mean that Black workers would no longer tolerate the starvation wages that they were being paid by their white employers. So the main programs created through the New Deal state in the 1930s, including Social Security, the new homeownership programs created through the Federal Housing Administration, and ultimately the GI Bill for returning veterans from World War II, carved African Americans out of their most important gains. This would begin to change in the 1960s when the Civil Rights Movement and the Black rebellions of that period incurred, and African Americans demanded inclusion into American affluence and what was by then understood to be the American dream. It is important to understand why these kinds of exclusionary, it's important to understand why even after the passage of important civil rights legislation in the 1960s, there is the Civil Rights Act, which banned, prohibited the use of racial segregation across the South. So the 1964 Civil Rights Act ended Jim Crow segregation. The 1965 Civil Rights Act allowed African Americans across the South to be able to vote. In 1954, segregation in education was prohibited. 1968, the Fair Housing Act was passed. All of these important legislative efforts at removing race and racial discrimination for the law are passed and implemented. But the question remains, why do these patterns of exclusion and economic exploitation in Black communities persist even after the law has been changed? And so one of the things that when I talked about earlier, talking about a low income homeownership program, is one of the reforms that was implemented to address these patterns of inequality in American public policy. So in the 1930s, when you have the Federal Housing Administration create a homeownership program that is largely only available to white people and encourages white people to leave cities and move to the suburbs and effectively cut Black people out of that program. This, I'm sure many people obviously have heard of the practice of redlining. This is when that practice begins, really takes hold and comes into existence, is in the 1930s. In the 1960s, by the end of the 1960s, a program is implemented finally to create homeownership opportunities for African Americans. By the end of the 1960s, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, had left no doubt that substandard housing, evidenced by rat infestation, was a recurring factor in the annual bouts of riots that roiled American cities throughout the decade. So from 1964 through 1968, more than 500,000 African Americans participated in rebellions or uprisings of one sort or another in more than 250 cities in the United States, in opposition to police brutality, to unemployment, but also importantly, to the conditions of substandard housing. The Kerner Commission is formed by the Johnson administration to investigate the causes of these continuing riots. And one of the discoveries that they make is that housing discrimination and the condition of housing is one of the things that is spurring African Americans to rebel on an annual basis. Identifying segregation at the root of those conditions and as a significant source of rage in Black communities, the Commission's findings called for historic changes to American housing policy. A landmark Supreme Court case, Jones versus Mayer, decided just weeks after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in the spring of 1968, drew upon the 1866 Civil Rights Act and the 13th Amendment in comparing housing segregation to slavery, arguing that, quote, when racial discrimination herds men into ghettos and makes their ability to buy property turn on the color of their skin, then it is a relic of slavery. The final piece of the battle to open the US housing market to African Americans came with the Housing and Urban Development Act in August of 1968. The 1968 Hud Act was Lyndon Johnson's last greatest legislative accomplishment. It was a bill planned in collaboration with representatives from private enterprise in what was known as the Kaiser Commission. The businessmen who participated described their promotion of single-family homeownership for poor people as, quote, socio-commercial enterprise or business with a conscience. Johnson described the legislation as the Magna Carta for the cities, and its focus on the market and ownership ensured that it was a bipartisan bill. For decades, federal officials had relied on public housing to shelter poor and low-income people. But by the end of the 1960s, public housing had become politically untenable, with endless jousts over its maintenance, location, and inhabitants. Housing for the poor suffered from a mixture of government neglect and shrinking tenancy, a result of the dangerous conditions endured by residents and the constant pressure for such housing to exclude anyone other than the poorest tenants. The HUD Act was a pivot away from the notion of public or state responsibility for housing the poor or low income. At the heart of the legislation was a low-income homeownership plan that aimed to transform low-income renters into homeowners. Federal officials turned to homeownership as a cheaper program where the costs of houses were absorbed by the program participants while the federal government paid regular subsidies to banks, which kept the state's cost lower than the upfront expenses necessary to develop, build, and manage public housing. These economic concerns also fit with the growing idea that homeownership could stabilize the anger and restiveness coursing through American cities. Freshman Senator Charles Percy, a Republican from Illinois, described the benefits of expanding homeownership as a, quote, new dawn of opportunity on which a new national effort to bring dignity and a better life to today's slum dwellers must be based. We can democratize our cities. We can give people of the ghetto a piece of the action, let them be somebody and achieve something. President Richard Nixon said of the bill, quote, people who own their own homes don't burn their neighborhoods. Rather, in pride and self-interest, they turn to fixing up their communities and making them livable for themselves and their neighbors. The terms of the new homeownership program were a low $200 down payment, 20% of the participants' income as their mortgage, regardless of the cost of the house, and an interest rate capped at 1%. The inclusion of federal mortgage insurance for the first time meant that in the worst case scenario, a foreclosure or abandonment, the federal government was obligated to pay back the mortgage to the lenders. The terms kept the price of the homes manageable for low income and working class people. But it also removed almost all of the risk for the real estate industry. As one official described the program, it's like doing business in heaven. You can't lose money. The unprecedented program linked federal agencies to real estate brokers and mortgage bankers to supply the loans to people in neighborhoods, and these organizations had previously excluded or redlined. But with the promise of lucrative subsidies and the guarantees of mortgage insurance and the promise of profit that came with them, the historic hostility of these private sector forces melted away, the hostility to lending to Black people in Black neighborhoods. But these same conditions also opened new pathways for corrupt real estate practices. Speculators and brokers bought up cheap, dilapidated properties, hoping to then flip them for higher prices and sales to people who would qualify for these new programs. The entirety of the program was in the hands of real estate operatives. HUD sent brokers lists of eligible properties. When real estate brokers matched a person with a house, they connected the prospective buyer with a mortgage lender. The mortgage lender consulted with HUD to determine if the person qualified for the program. At no time did an individual with a representative of the federal government, speak with a representative of the federal government. Not only could money be made by flipping cheap properties, but brokers found it easy to bribe poorly paid federal housing administrator appraisers to inflate the value of the houses in the new urban market. Bankers made money on the front end of the real estate deal by securing the loan, and then they made money on the back end with expensive closing costs associated with selling the property. Everyone made money, except the poor Black families that were disproportionately saddled with these broken homes in cities across the country. The federal government's turn to homeownership was also a consummate expression of what I describe as post-war racial liberalism, which viewed inclusion into American democracy through the vehicles of citizenship, law, and free market capitalism as the key to unlocking equality and social mobility for Black citizens, just as it had done for white Americans through the New Deal and the GI Bill for veterans returning after World War II. But in narrowing their focus to access alone, racial liberals overlooked the racist practices embedded within those institutions. This was shockingly clear in the real estate industry. Banks in the real estate industry had played a central role in creating the urban housing crisis, exemplified by the persistence of dilapidation and disrepair in Black housing, caused by decades of disinvestment and refusal to lend African Americans to lend to them on equitable terms. So now the sudden involvement of these same private sector forces should have been seen as a recipe for disaster. This obviously did not mean that African Americans should continue to be excluded. Rather, it demanded greater scrutiny, greater enforcement of rules regarding the protection of civil rights, and specific plans to undo the practices that had resulted in Black exclusion in the first place. Without that level of scrutiny and the threat of behavior-altering punishment to those institutions, there was nothing in place to prevent the continuation of those practices. Instead of scrutiny and regulation, predatory practices continued. In other words, the racist exclusion of Black people gave way to their predatory inclusion. The notion of risk facilitated the charade of race neutrality as the neighborhood conditions and financial insecurity of African Americans that had been created by the racist actions and behavior of government agencies, bankers, and real estate brokers were now twisted into evidence that African Americans should be treated cautiously, if not differently, in the marketplace. Predatory inclusion described the different, more expensive, and ultimately exploitative terms upon which African Americans were admitted into the conventional world of real estate under the guise of colorblind neutrality. In reality, decades of color-conscious exclusion created poverty and the conditions of dilapidation and deterioration in poor and working class communities that then were turned into evidence, the visual proof that these neighborhoods, and most importantly, the people who lived in those neighborhoods, posed a risk to property values and loan repayment. More generally, predatory inclusion described the ways that African Americans were welcomed into institutions and practices from which they had formerly been excluded because they were new, supposedly colorblind ways in which they could be extracted from or financially exploited. In the supposed colorblind, race-neutral American marketplace, Black investment in the housing market could actually result in credit shattering, insurmountable debt, with no hopes of their home gaining value over time. This, of course, did not mean that homes of Black people had no value. Black housing, even in its greatest distress, could be fortresses of refuge, places of communion, and sites of connection. But rarely was it the financial asset that it had been for millions of white Americans. But it was this issue of value that so much of the housing market turned on. The key to the American dream of homeownership, and I just want to say I'm focusing on this because in almost every single discussion about the racial wealth gap, it almost always returns to, oh, we have to increase Black homeownership. This is the way out of the racial wealth gap. And so I'm talking about how value is constructed differently for Black majority neighborhoods compared to white majority neighborhoods. The key to the American dream of homeownership was not just simple possession of property, but just as important was whether the value of the property would rise over time, increasing the owner's equity. In a society with an anemic social welfare state, such as the United States, the boost in home values were determinative of one's quality of life. The ascending value of a home could help finance a college education, an unforeseen crisis, or contribute to a comfortable and dignified retirement. But homes did not ascend or descend in value on their own terms. The the surrounding neighborhood, and the value or lack of value of other buildings, businesses, and other institutions helped determine whether a neighborhood was good or bad. In the United States, value was also shaped by whether a property owner was white or black, surrounded by other white people or surrounded by black people. There is a perception in our society that value is intrinsic, tangible, real. We know what has value when we see it, just as clearly as we understand the lack of value when we see it. But in this way, value within the housing market is socially constructed, a strange combination of race, place, and the perceptions of the buying public. Or as sociologist Dalton Conley put it, quote, property values are where culture meets economics. Frederick M. Babcock was considered an originator of the practice of real estate appraisal. And he wrote, quote, and this was in the 1930s, it is obvious that there is no absolute ironclad method of computing real estate values, because values are a social phenomenon dependent upon human behavior. The intensely subjective process of determining the value of property or a neighborhood, or what I described as the pseudoscience of real estate appraisal, was inherently informed by the presence or absence of African Americans. The American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers said as much when its professional manual maintained, quote, that the clashes of nationalities with dissimilar cultures contributes to the destruction of value. When a new class of people of a different race, color, nationality, or culture moves into a neighborhood, old inhabitants think that the neighborhood is losing desirability. Thus, the intensity of anti-Black racism in American society was inevitably wound into these notions of property value, neighborhood value, and community value. The assumption that Black people were harmful for property values drove the desire to keep them out, to keep them segregated. It justified their marginalization in the housing market. It offered a common sense explanation for the disproportionate conditions of dilapidation, distress, and substandard housing, largely owned by whites, but rented to Black people. The difference in value in white housing compared to Black housing produced a tension between what we could call exchange value, how much something can be paid for, what is the cost of something, and use value. What is its usefulness? What is its utility? It produced a tension between exchange value and use value in housing, or what we might describe more intimately as the difference between real estate, exchange value, and a home, use value. These contradictory objectives of real estate and a home, one a commodity and the other intimating a place of belonging, also reinforced reactionary racial norms and deepened the perception of dual housing markets working at dual purposes. Mid-century narratives of what it meant to be white, embodied in conceptions of the suburban-based nuclear family, quintessential whiteness, and the perception of home as an expression of use value within white communities. Conversely, developing narratives concerning the perceived domestic dysfunction within Black living spaces, whether that is non-normative family formations or poverty or dilapidated living structures, cast Black dwellings as incapable of achieving the status of home, thus reducing them to their base exchange value. Where white housing was seen as an asset developed through inclusion and the accruable possibilities of its surrounding properties, Black housing was marked by its exclusion and isolation, where value was extracted and not imbued. These racialized narratives of families, communities, and their built environments reinforced and naturalized the segregated practices among real estate brokers, mortgage bankers, and the white public. Indeed, these perceptions of insurmountable difference, steeped in culture, constituted the underwriting criteria that determined who was to be excluded and who should be included. In this way, segregation was profitable. Value accrued to white housing the further it was from African Americans and their neighborhoods. But value could also be found in segregated and distressed housing for African Americans. Only the value did not flow to Black homeowners. Black people, in some sense, functioned as vessels through which capital flowed from enclosed Black neighborhoods out to landlords, to bankers, to real estate operatives. Real estate operatives confined each group to its own section of a single housing market to preserve the allure of exclusivity for whites while satisfying the demand for housing among African Americans. But this was not evidence of a dual housing market, but of a single American housing market that tied race to risk, linking both the rise and fall of property values and generating profits that grew into the sinews that bound it all together. White housing and white neighborhoods did well because Black housing and Black neighborhoods were robbed of federal subsidies and guarantees. A quote unquote white housing market would have actually been unintelligible without its Black counterpart. Both relied on the other to make each legible. One could not have existed without the other. This reality exposed the thinness of the notion that inclusion alone could be offered as a palliative to the rigid structures of white supremacy that held the market, the governing institutions, and the law itself together. The collusive relationship between the public and private sector in the production of public policy, housing policy, undermined the potential for inclusion to make meaning of Black citizenship. And these limits became starkly clear with the new Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. Consider the experiences of Janice Johnson. On September 18th, 1970, Janice Johnson bought her first home in Philadelphia with a mortgage guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration. By all previous standards, Johnson was a typical home buyer. She was an atypical home buyer. She was a Black single mother on welfare living with her 8-year-old son in a decaying apartment in a building that had recently been condemned by city officials in Northeast Philadelphia. Now facing eviction, Johnson needed to quickly find a new place to live when she found an apartment for rent in that same neighborhood. She called the landlord in anticipation, but her hopes were dashed when he told her that she could not rent the apartment because she was a welfare recipient. The landlord quickly pivoted, though, from offering a rental to suggesting that Janice Johnson could buy a house in the same neighborhood. As a welfare recipient, she was now qualified for one of HUD's new low-income homeownership programs and was able to purchase the house with an FHA-backed loan for $5,600. Within weeks, however, Janice Johnson realized her home was not the fulfillment of the American dream. It was the beginning of an American nightmare. Within days of moving into her new house, the sewer line broke, spewing wastewater all over the basement floor. The electricity for the house was sporadic and haphazard. There were holes and other irregularities in the foundation of the home. The compromised structure of the house was not the worst of it. On Halloween night, Johnson's son, Edward, woke up to find a rat in his bed. Janice Johnson saw rats running throughout her house, including the kitchen. She called the agent who sold her the house to complain about its condition. He sent workmen out on a couple of occasions, but they even patched the failing plaster in her dining room. But soon after, the real estate agent reminded her that the problems in her home were now her own. They were homeowners' business. Within a few years of the implementation of the low-income homeownership programs for HUD, there was a backlash against people using the programs. And once again, the participants, African Americans, were examined, were under scrutiny, not the issues of fraud and corruption involving government actors and representatives from the real estate industry, even while there were congressional hearings pointing out issues of fraud and corruption within the FHA federal agency, among mortgage bankers, among real estate brokers. Most of the public scrutiny fell onto Black families and Black women in particular, who were utilizing the services of these programs. And the end result then was not a reformation of the regulatory system, was not an effort to figure out how to more effectively enforce the measures forbidding discrimination in the Fair Housing Act, not more effectively to monitor the activities of the profit-seeking partners within the public-private partnership, but was again, the scrutiny turned into an attack, really a political attack on the systems of public assistance in the realm of housing, public housing, and also these low-income homeownership programs. And the problems and crises that pervaded these programs within a number of years were wielded by conservatives in the political right to demonstrate why quote unquote welfare programs do not work. In closing, when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, he called for HUD to convene a special commission on housing policies in 1982. For more than 30 years after pledging to provide decent homes for American citizens, as the federal government had done, the federal government and its Department of Housing continue to fail in the achievement of that goal. The latest Housing Commission, paneled by Reagan, called its report To House a Nation, and it began with a criticism of the 1968 HUD Act. The HUD Act had left as its legacy, quote, a belief in the potency of government programs. Reagan's Commission on Housing promised the opposite. Quote, the genius of the market economy, freed from the distortions forced by government housing policies and regulations that swung erratically from loving to hostile, can provide for housing far better than the federal government. It was a conclusion that could only be reached by ignoring the actual origins of the HUD Act and the reasons behind its demise. Lyndon Johnson had also promised to unleash, quote, the genius of private industry. But lackadaisical management, erratic regulations, and trenchant racial discrimination, combined with the end of redlining and the predacious inclusion of formerly excluded Black urbanites, allowed the real estate industry to bleed inner cities dry. It was not government intrusion that sank the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership program. It was government negligence. But this malfeasance was not just an issue of poorly motivated personnel. It was the outcome of mismatched objectives and impossible tasks. When public policies are guided by the objectives of private enterprise, as the HUD homeownership programs undoubtedly were, they are clinched in a dance of conflict. As magnanimous as the life insurance industry and the other titans of business who argued for, quote, socio-commercial enterprise in the 1960s tried to present themselves, in the end, The objective of profit making outpaced the necessity for safe and sound housing. One glaring reason for this spoke to the heart of the conflict. Real estate profits were rooted in residential segregation. Race was turned into profit. There is a tendency to view the post-riot city, the so-called urban crisis, as trapped in the stasis of blight and inevitability of decay over time. But there's another way to look at this. The late 1960s and 70s were defined by changing political, social, and economic dynamics. And the inner city was at the nexus of these processes. New financial instruments, such as mortgage-backed securities, produced an intense international demand for more homeowners and more money for home financing, while lax oversight and regulation incentivized unscrupulous and predatory targeting of urban communities. Far from being a static site of dilapidation and ruin, the urban core was becoming an attractive place of unparalleled economic opportunity, just not for the people who live there. And these have important historical lessons today. They have direct bearing on many of the communities. These programs, the impact of these programs have direct bearing on communities and neighborhoods we live in today. Housing policies over much of the 20th century, and certainly the housing crisis of the 1970s, contributed to the uneven development of Black urban and suburban communities compared to their white urban and suburban counterparts. The geographic scars created by the HUD FHA crisis in the early 1970s, where nearly 80,000 single-family homes were repossessed, but hundreds of thousands of more multifamily units also went into foreclosure, exacerbated a crisis of abandonment that animated the optics of distress and dilapidation. A generation later, these optics of distress and dilapidation became the basis for designating a place and the people who live there as subprime. For more than 50 years now, the private sector has been viewed as the most capable of ending a persisting housing crisis. And yet those crises have become even more stark over time, creating even greater degrees of housing precariousness. The net loss in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, the net loss of more than 240,000 homes for African Americans, created the pretext for mortgage lenders to once again engage in exclusionary practices that marginalize potential Black homeowners. But this is only one aspect of the crisis. The recurring perception of risky Black buyers has opened new pathways for the reemergence of naked, predatory practices in the real estate market, from rent-to-own schemes to the reappearance of land installment contracts, basically buying a home on an installment plan in lieu of conventional mortgages. Real estate continues to pilfer African Americans in search of housing security and housing stability. Like I said, the issues around homeownership are not the singular explanation for the racial wealth gap, but it is reflective of continuing patterns of inequality, of economic exploitation, of unchecked discriminatory practices, of weaknesses within the regulatory regime, of the skewed priorities that emerge out of public-private partnerships. And to get serious about closing the gap, not just by looking at questions of home ownership, but looking at the ways that the patterns of inequity that we see in the housing market are reflected through different areas of Black life. And the question really is, how do we get enforcement of the existing laws and regulations that we have on the books as one piece of one piece of this issue. Like I said, there are many different explanations for the racial wealth gap, and there is not a silver bullet to solve all of these questions, but at least as one aspect of it, I think that there is much to learn from the history and pattern of discriminatory practices in the housing market. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Yes.
Thank you so much. That was so excellent. We're so grateful that you were willing to come and speak to us today. We apologize for technical difficulties and thank you for your patience. I'm going to, ask if there's any questions quickly. I know that we're out of time, but if there's any questions from the audience, I can facilitate that now. I have one back here.
Professor Taylor, I don't know if you can hear me or not. It's a rather devastating presentation, and it concluded with, okay, now what do I do? And can you give us maybe one or two clues as to where we go from here for the way out? Because you don't want to leave feeling like it's a mess, we know that, but just give us a couple of clues as to how you see some pathways to a better mortgage lending system and a way to look at the culture that we've created.
Okay, thank you for that. And let me just say, I teach public policy at Princeton, and so I think policy is important, and I also think that it can be become a way of almost averting deeper discussions about the nature of inequity in our country. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't talk about policy, but I'm always concerned that we think that there is a policy solution that if we just tweak or change this or that, that somehow we can undo these patterns and practices that have really functioned almost unabated for the entirety of the 20th century and now into the 21st century. So I just want to say that to begin with. Now, I do think that the way that I think about this is one, we have existing laws on the books that prohibit the racial discrimination in the buying, selling, renting, financing of housing. And we have to ask, why is the enforcement so weak? Why is it often incumbent upon those who are victims of discrimination to really facilitate and guide and be the motor of a process that addresses that? And so one of the conclusions, so we need stronger enforcement, but it's also, we have to understand why it's weak. And one of the reasons, I believe, is because of the close relationship between the private sector and public policy making, and the assumption that the public sector or that the private sector will be responsible for the production of all housing in the United States. And so the US government has effectively removed itself from the process of producing housing, managing housing in the US, and outsourced that to the private sector. Well, once you have done that, you have now undercut your position as a regulator, because you are completely dependent on the private sector to produce housing. So part of it is not just about what is the policy solution. Part of it is about what are the questions that we're asking. Are we asking the right questions so that we come to a more realistic set of policies that directly deal with the nature of the problem. And so the questions that we have to ask have to do with the central role of the private sector and the ways in which that might distort or undermine the ability of the federal government in particular to enforce its own rules and regulations regarding discrimination within the housing market.
One last question, and then we will wrap it up. Thank you. Peter, go ahead.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Professor Taylor. My name is Peter Mullen, and I work at a nonprofit in which I have the great pleasure of providing free financial literacy, free financial education, counseling for folks of all shapes and sizes and all over the Boston area. My question is much more direct to you, and I do not want necessarily a policy answer, but a direct right to me directly as a provider of education and my private company. What can I do in the sense that I provide free financial literacy, education, counseling that would help this at all from this point forward?
Thank you for your question. I mean, that's a hard question to answer. I don't know what you as an individual can do. I know that I worry about the scale of what, you know, a particular foundation or a particular non-governmental organization can do, because I often think that that work is important, it's on the ground, it's crucial, and it's also insufficient. I feel like because of the lack of coverage that these kinds of events and these kinds of problems receive, that there is a vast underestimation of the degree of need, of deprivation that exists in our society. And that really, we have to change the discussion away from, or not change it, but pivot away just from what an individual can do, what a particular company can do. We face problems that can only be solved on the scale of the federal government. That is when we're talking about 43% of Black working people make $30,000 a year or under. That is not something that you can be literate out of. You know, that is not something you can, you know, figure out how to save better out of. That is something that requires a serious federal intervention, a serious redistribution of wealth in our society to address. And so we have to stop underestimating the degree and scale of the problems and the crises that we face. And that means not to the exclusion of other resources and other programs and other particular practices, but that we most certainly need the resources, the reach, the scale that the federal government provides to realistically begin to deal with what are historic programs, what are or problems, historic degrees of inequity in this country.
Thank you. We agree. And before I forget, I just want to remind everyone that Keeanga recently published a new book, Race for Profit: How Banks in Real Estate Undermined Black Home Ownership. So we definitely recommend that everyone check it out.